Good evening, folks. How you all doing? That was mostly the front don't respond there. That's good. We've had some good topics tonight. We've had ultra-processed food, sex, and now we're about to talk about pro wrestling. Ultra-processed food and pro wrestling go pretty much hand in hand. Not so much sex, though. Not a lot of sex when you're a wrestling fan growing up, because you got wrestling to watch. You know what I'm saying? All right, let's crack into it. So tonight's speech is called The 4 Flavours of Professional Wrestling. There's a photo of me when I used to go to F45. Quick show of hands, who's ever heard of the WWE before? All right, most of you, that's great. So you probably know that WWE is the biggest wrestling company in America, but what you might not know is that there are actually 4 other we call them the Big Four. They're Big Four wrestling markets. So those 4, apart from America, you've also got Mexico, you've got Europe, and then you've got Japan. These are kind of the Big Four wrestling markets. There's obviously, I'm generalizing a lot in this speech because I just don't have the time, but those are the Big Four, and those are the 4 I'm going to talk about tonight. So each of these countries, they will have a different style of professional wrestling. You're probably thinking many things right now, but I guess the main thing you're thinking is, wait a second, Taylor, isn't wrestling fake? I don't have time to get into it tonight, but yes, it is fake. it doesn't matter. Everything you watch is fake. It is fake, and that's not why we love it. So if you think about it more as like a live theatre experience, it's very Shakespearean. They actually say that the Bard himself would have been a fan if he was alive today. So think about wrestling not as a real competition, but it's a Shakespearean play where the whole arena, including an audience, are part of the show. And the performers tell stories. They're usually clashes of good and evil. There's usually a good guy and a bad guy in the matches. And that's kind of why we like it. It's a live theatre experience. So the sort of inspiration for this topic or the speech today is from a wrestler here called Chris Hero. Looks a bit like me, doesn't he? So that's more accurate than the first frame, I guess. So Chris Hero tweeted that he could sum up the 4 wrestling styles in basically a single sentence. I'm going to go through this with you now. So we have the first one here. He called the American style a morality play. He called the Mexican style a marriage of pageantry and acrobatics. He called the European style physical and mental chess. And he called the Japanese style struggle through sport. So I think maybe you're starting to figure out kind of what the difference is in the presentation of the combat stuff. We're going to go through each of them one by one, and I'm going to give you kind of like a general overview of the history. Then we're going to talk about how they tell stories. We are going to talk about how it reflects the culture of the country that it comes from. And then each one, I've picked a wrestler from each country that sort of like embodies the style. Does that sound good? Yeah. All right, so we'll start with the American one, morality play. So, what does morality play mean? It is very Shakespearean. There's a lot of talking. They're just as likely to go at each other on the microphone as they are in the ring. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The origins. So, wrestling pretty much in the whole world started from the same kind of origins. Has anybody been to a carnival before? Really slow response there, but that's okay. So the way it started, it was in 1860s to 1880s. Around that time is when wrestling was kind of forming as a thing. And it sort of started out as a genuine competition. There would be something called Cornish wrestling, which was like proper wrestling. And then the other thing they would do is they would, in between like strongman acts, they would let a member of the audience come up, and if they could last 10 minutes in the ring with one of the athletes, they would get a prize. And so I thought instead of doing questions tonight, that's how we're going to end the speech. If anybody wants to last 10 minutes with Nicole, then you win a prize. So what happened was they were letting people challenge the athletes. But they really quickly learned that because these were genuine athletes, the matches were over in like 10 seconds. And they weren't very interesting to watch. So they started asking the athletes if they could learn a bit of showmanship and kind of play it up for the crowd and make them go longer. And then they realized, oh wait, we could just get 2 guys to do that. And then they started selling tickets, and the rest is sort of history. So that's kind of like a general history of like wrestling around the world. They all do have some little bits and pieces we'll go into, but that's kind of the main thing. So how does the American style reflect the culture? So football and amateur wrestling, as you can see up here, they are pretty big sports in America. Pretty much everyone plays football and everyone wrestles when they're little kids. And so that is reflected in the style. The wrestling athletes are like, they're big dudes. They look like bodybuilders. They're big football players. A lot of them come from football and they move into wrestling. The style is they call it smash mouth wrestling. That's like kind of a shorthand for the American style. And there's just like a lot of powerful moves, a lot of big slams that you'd see from the Olympic wrestling. Not a lot of finesse, if that makes sense to you. So each culture has certain moves that are like in storyline more powerful than other moves. And in America, there's a move called the spear. And that's like a running football tackle. And in America, that's like a big finishing move. No one's getting up after a spear. Not so much in other countries, but yeah, it reflects the culture, because obviously they're all used to seeing how much it hurts to get tackled in football, I guess. So how do they tell stories? Like I said at the start, the American one is the morality play. It's very Shakespearean. It's a lot of like personal disagreements between the two wrestlers. Maybe they were a tag team, maybe they were like friends or in a team together. Something went bad, one of them was jealous of the other, stabbed him in the back, that kind of thing. That's like a big thing in American professional wrestling. It's very like a soap opera, if that kind of makes sense to you. And so personified as a character, and this is the other thing I didn't mention it for, but the other thing you kind of think of when you think of America is you think of Hollywood, right? So personified as a wrestler, it is The Rock. You all know who The Rock is, I assume? Yeah. So The Rock is pretty much the embodiment of American wrestling. He's massive. He wears like $2,000 sunglasses, $1,000 shirts. He wears a gold chain around his neck. He's very confident and outspoken and brash, and he's just as likely to beat you up like on the microphone. Have you all heard his catchphrases before? He talks about taking people to the SmackDown hotel. He says he's going to lay the smackdown on people. He'll tell people to take something, turn it sideways, stick it straight up your candy ass. There's a lot of catchphrases with The Rock, and that's basically the embodiment of American wrestling. So we'll move on to the next one, Mexico. This is a marriage of pageantry and acrobatics. So again, show me your hands if you've kind of seen a Mexican wrestling before. You're probably familiar with the mask, right? Yeah. So that's the main point of difference, I guess. I've been told that Mexican wrestling is a lot more like a Saturday morning cartoon than like if America is a soap opera, Mexican wrestling is a Saturday morning cartoon. Like, you don't get a lot of shades of grey with the characters. The good guys are really good paragons of goodness, and the bad guys are like, tie a woman to a train tracks kind of mustache twirling bad guys. They're bad guys. America is a little bit more shades of grey. You get a bit more like ambiguous characters there. And so the origin of Mexican wrestling, pretty simple. It's just when it was spreading throughout Europe in sort of 1860 to 1880, there was something called the French intervention going on in Mexico, which sounds kind of like colonialism to me. So I think that was what happened there. But do you want to hear the origin of masks, where the masks came from? Yeah, so I thought, I've actually got some sort of dates and stuff down here. So I thought it was a reference to the Mayans and the Aztecs. They would do this ritual combo where they would put on these feathery headdresses and they would sort of dress as gods or powerful figures. But it's not that at all. I was way off. So masks in professional wrestling. There were two guys that started off at the 1865 World's Fair in Paris. A guy called Theobald Bauer was the first one to wear a mask in wrestling. And then about 50 years later, in 1915, another wrestler called Mort Henderson started wrestling under a mask, and they were the first two guys to do it. There was an American wrestler called Cyclone McKee, who was moving to Texas, and he wanted to change his character up when he was moving. So he asked the promoter if he could wear a mask. And this is literally what he asked for. He said, I would like, and this is a quote here, a hood, something you can put on, tie on, like the Ku Klux Klan or something like that. Right? Right? What? Of all the places. So, that's literally where it came from. And it just caught on. The people in Mexico loved the idea of the masked sort of superhero, the masked character. And the rest is kind of history. That's the significance of it. So, how does it reflect the culture? That's kind of a little bit of that with the mask thing. But then the characters are very colourful. There's a lot of pageantry. If you've seen the Day of the Dead, kind of colourful outfits there, and I think that's a salsa dancer on the right. That's, Mexican culture is very colourful, very jovial, very vibrant, and the wrestlers are like that. The difference between American wrestling and Mexican is that they do a lot more acrobatic kind of stuff. You can see that is a wrestler called Sin Cara there. He's jumping off the top rope. And I suspect because it's more of a cartoon, it's like, they jump around and it's very action-packed and there's a lot of rolling about. And so it's quite cool to watch. I recommend you go and watch some Mexican wrestling if you've never seen it before. It's quite cool. And not super different to American, the way they tell their stories. It's just the characters are more exaggerated. And this next person here, personified as a wrestler, this is the personification of the Mexican wrestling style. Has anyone seen this guy before? So he is called El Santo, which means the saint. So was that a yes from the crowd here? Nice. So he debuted in 1941, following on with the mask kind of tradition there, and somehow this guy just had like a charisma that really caught on, and he was like, his name is the Saint. He was like a paragon of virtue. They made comic books and movies about him, and all of them are like, it's like El Santo versus the werewolves, or like El Santo versus the vampires. It's all like this kind of occult, demonic stuff. And his career went for about 50 years. They literally refer to him as the Mexican Superman. Like that's how kind of like in the culture El Santo was. There's a lot of wrestlers still going today that are like the son of El Santo. There's a thing in Mexican wrestling where if you're the son of another wrestler, they call you El Mijo del Santo, I think is how you pronounce it, which just means the son of whatever. And there's a lot, the long lineages of all these wrestlers that are sons of each other. So that is still very much going on today. Next one, British wrestling, physical and mental chess. So to explain the origins of this, do you all know what a holiday camp is in England? Any people? From what I've researched, it's basically like, it's like a massive village that you can go and stay at, and it's usually by the beach. It's kind of like, a little bit like a motel, kind of like a summer camp. They have like entertainment and stuff there. And so that was a big thing, a big place you'd go and see wrestling in Britain. There was a big boom they had in the kind of, I've got the dates written down here. They had something called the ITV boom. So from 1955 to 1993, there's a channel in Britain called ITV. And they would play wrestling from like all over the world. So most people became familiar with it by watching American wrestling, Japanese wrestling, Mexican wrestling, and everything like that. Once ITV stopped doing that, the only place you could see it were at these holiday camps. So it's just like outdoor wrestling. I think sometimes they'd be done in tents, but it was sort of children's entertainment, I guess. And we'll move on to how does it reflect the culture. So, British wrestling is very no-nonsense. It is very like I said, it's a mental and a physical chess. And I guess if we compare it to the American style, like the American wrestlers are like peacocks. They want you to know how good they are. They're going to wear nice clothes. They're going to talk about how good they are. Whereas the British wrestlers are more interested in just beating the other guy. Like they don't wear fancy gear. They don't wear fancy robes when they come to the ring. That sort of thing. And I feel like that kind of reflects the British like stiff upper lip kind of, just get on with it sort of vibes. And so hence the brothers there. And then the other thing is a lot of it's presented as a very sort of underground kind of vibe. Like if you've ever watched the Sherlock Holmes where he's fighting bare knuckle underground, Peaky Blinders, they have quite a bit of it there. Any Guy Ritchie movie. That's kind of the vibe of British wrestling. I've got a screenshot in the next one. So, as you can see, it's not in an arena. It's just in like a dark kind of they usually hire theatres out to do it. So how do they tell stories? So the whole origin of British wrestling comes out of something called Cornish wrestling, which was like legit wrestling. And to explain it like in a real quick way to understand how the chess game worked, like let's say one wrestler tries to take the other wrestler's ankle, but in order to grab his ankle, he has to make his other hand like available to be attacked. So the first wrestler can counterattack and try and take that wrestler's shoulder, and they just go back and forth trying to essentially grab one of these limbs and then put a submission hold on. Like I think the guy on the top there is going for something called a surfboard, and if he could get it locked in, he would get his hands underneath Zach's chin and then flip over, so Zach would be kind of like a turtle on his back trying to get away. And that's pretty much it. It's very no nonsense. It's very much a technical competition. It's just one guy trying to be a better wrestler than the other one. They don't often have finishing moves in England. It's just like if they can catch each other with a submission move, then like he's done. He taps out. It's kind of like a real fight in that sense, I guess. So then, personified as a wrestler, we have this man here called Zack Sabre Jr. He, I don't know, like there's not a lot to Zach. He's like his moniker is the submission master, and if you watch any of his matches, it's basically just 15 minutes of him twisting the opponent up into all sorts of interesting shapes. And Zach honestly doesn't have a finishing move. He has about 7, so like he can catch you, and his whole kind of thing is that he can catch you in any hold, and that could be the end of the match. So that's how he builds the storytelling, that like it could end at any time kind of thing. All right, so the last one here. It's Japanese style, struggle through sports. So this is my favorite one. I used to live in Japan, so I watched a lot of Japanese wrestling. So the origins of Japan. I've got some dates here. So what was interesting is in 1880, when it was catching on in other parts of the world, there was one guy called Matsuda Sorakichi who tried to bring it to Japan around the same time, but it didn't work. It didn't catch on for some reason. So then, when it actually did catch on, was about 90 years later, in 1951, when the guy that's on the screen now, he's called Riki Dozan, and he is a former sumo wrestler who actually got into professional wrestling. And in 1951, as you can imagine, straight after the war, the Japanese sort of like national identity was in a bit of a slump because they hadn't had a good time in that war, to put it lightly. Yeah, just a gloss over that. And Riki Dozan became like a hero of the people. You know, people could rally around him. He was a strong masculine figure, and so he became really popular. And then, I don't have time to get into it today, but he had 2 students who they had a different philosophy about what made a good wrestling match. And so they split into 2 styles. In Japan, there's King's Road style, and then there's Strong style. I can talk about it maybe in the Q&A if someone wants to hear about that. But so he started off professional wrestling there, became super popular, and that's all kind of because of him today. So how does it reflect the culture? I don't know if you can tell, but you know, Japan is a sumo country, so they're like quite happy for their wrestlers to be a bit chonkier than the guys in America who are like bodybuilding guys. So is there any other thick kings in the crowd tonight? Japanese wrestling's a good one for you. And so like, yeah, the wrestlers are bigger and they've got that sumo background, but they also have martial arts like jiu-jitsu and karate. And so the big selling point between Japanese matches and the rest of the world is like, they'll actually kick and punch each other really hard, like basically for real, which you might think defeats the point of professional wrestling, but it's really good to watch. And so that's kind of how the wrestling started there. And so the main theme of Japanese wrestling is the idea, like Chris here said, it's a struggle through sport. So it's just as much of a struggle against yourself as it is your opponent. So the whole idea of Japanese wrestling is that you overcome your limits, and they'll have these things in their matches where like characters will have different levels of finishing moves. So one character, actually I can talk about it with the thing. I'll tell you that example in the next slide. So how do they tell stories? Like I said, they punch and kick each other for real. He's probably clobbering him for real there. That is, what is he? Satoshi Kojima. He was a big star in the kind of 80s. And yeah, they don't do a lot of talking. There's very little talking in Japanese matches. It's presented very seriously. Like it's not it's like as far from Shakespearean as you could get. They're presented like athletes. It's just this guy wants to beat this guy. They're going to kick each other in the head for real for 15 minutes, and then whoever's left standing when it ends is the winner. That's kind of thing. And like they'll do something called no selling, which is where, you know, when like if you punch someone in a wrestling match, they'll whip their head back to make it look like you hit them. But in Japanese wrestling, quite often they'll like hit each other kind of in the collarbone with their elbow, just like back and forth like that, and it'll be one of those like, you know, I hit the guy, he hits me back, and it, you know, to prove how tough they are kind of thing, and then usually one of them falls down. So then, personified as a wrestler, this guy here is called Kenta Kobashi. And why does he embody Japanese wrestling? Because when he started wrestling, he was booked to lose his first 63 matches, I think. Yeah. And that was designed to like show the audience that he never gives up. He's always going to keep getting back up when he loses. And like I was saying before, the different levels of finishing moves. So if he's fighting a weaker opponent than himself, he would just use a move called the Burning Lariat, which he basically just hits them across the chest with his forearm. That'll be strong enough to take out a much weaker opponent. Then, if it's a person on the same level as him, he'll do something called a moonsault, which is where he jumps off the top rope, does a backflip, and lands on the opponent, and that's like his level 2 finisher. And then Kenta Kobashi has a move called the Burning Hammer, which is like, he puts them on his shoulders, and then he kind of just dumps them on top of their head, like that. He's only done that move, he wrestled for like decades, probably 30, 40 years. He only did that move 7 times in his whole career, and like no one has ever kicked out, like, you know, when they pin them afterwards, no one has kicked out of that move. It's like in Japanese wrestling lore, the Burning Hammer is like, you're done when they hit you with the Burning Hammer. And so that's kind of the philosophy of the matches there is, he was surpassing his limits to come up with a new move, and then that was the one that ended in all the matches. So I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but that is the end of my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed listening to something you probably wouldn't have considered otherwise, and I hope you'll give professional wrestling a try, maybe in the future. So thanks for listening.
Yeah.
All right, we've got some time for questions.
Yes, we do.
So over the last 10 years or so, the New Zealand wrestling scene started to sort of come in its own.
Oh, yeah.
This is kind of like a 2-part question.
Yes.
The first part is, have you been to many local wrestling shows, like the one at Kaiapoi Club on June 15th? Get your tickets now, Unified Championship Wrestling.
Hell yeah.
And what styles do you think the New Zealand, from what you've seen, are the New Zealand wrestlers, or is the New Zealand scene kind of leaning into?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, 100% recommend going out to see those shows. I've been to a few of them. So you must be like a fan, or are you a wrestler?
I'm one of the promoters.
Are you really?
I do a character, I'm not a wrestler, yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, I know who you are.
Yeah.
So you know Elliot Samuels? Yeah. He is one of my best friends, so I'm very good friends with a wrestler from out there. So yeah, absolutely go and see Unified Pro Wrestling. When did you say it was? June?
So the date of the event is June 15th. You can get your tickets at championshipwrestling.co.nz.
Yeah, so do that. I've actually done a little bit of wrestling training with those guys as well, and it was a lot of fun. What was the second? Oh, the New Zealand style. Yeah, so you might disagree or agree with this, but I feel like the New Zealand style is still figuring out who it is, because much like New Zealand culture, like we all grew up watching American TV, but we're descended from the Brits. We've got Australia right over there, so it's like a bit of a melting pot. And so I don't know if the New Zealand exactly has one distinct style. It feels like we're still figuring out what that is. There's a lot of big boys like me in wrestling in New Zealand, so that's one thing I've noticed. Maybe we've kind of got that same thing as the Japan, but yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
It's interesting because we've got a few international wrestlers over here, like one of the guys that's doing the rounds, his name's Marcus Cole, and he's got a very UK style, but I think it really depends. We've got Aaron Hennaday over here at the moment who wrestled over in Japan, so I think it's a mixing board, but I think that depends on the company. There's different companies doing different things in every city. Yeah.
Are you going to see Marcus Cole when he's at the next show?
I'm going to cut it off there and ask if there's any other questions.
Tell him to respond to my request to be on my podcast. I've sent him a DM, but he didn't respond.
G'day, down the back here.
How you doing?
I was wondering how many hours a week of pro wrestling do you watch?
Probably like 5, 6 maybe. There's 2 main shows that I follow. Raw, which is WWE's one, that is about 3 hours. I'll usually watch that. And then what if there's a New Japan show on or AEW, stuff like that? Are you a fan yourself, or are you just looking at me as an example of not what to do?
No, not really. I kind of watch UFC and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
Real stuff.
I knew a jab was coming. Nicole, move on. Can we move on from that? I don't want to embarrass this guy in front of his friends.
Any other questions?
Oh, dear.
No.
All
Fantastic.
right, we'll call it there.
Okay.
That's me, is it? All right, thank you, folks. Have a good one.